Welcome back to Codex. Our speaker today is Liz Munch from Michigan State. Professor Munch is an expert in topological data analysis. Today, she'll tell us about how to use topological summaries to compare shapes. Take it away, Liz.
All right. Well, thank you all for the invitation, and it's lovely seeing a nice virtual turnout, and yeah, it's a perk to not have to go deal with airplanes either. So thank you for the invitation. So I'm gonna echo what Dustin just said, which is that if you would like to ask a question, I am happy to have you stop me. This is the kind of thing that I would rather meet people where they're interested and understand what's going on. And so if you want to ask a question, please just stop or ask in the chat. I'm happy to go back and explain things. So like Dustin said, so I'm interested in TDA, so topological data analysis, and in particular, I'm going to be talking in this particular talk about TDA, where I'm analyzing shapes that are actually embedded in probably 2 or 3 dimensions. So when I'm talking about shape in data, in this particular talk, I mean it in the most obvious sense you could possibly think of, which is that I probably have things like scans of something that I'm interested in analyzing. So for instance, so this picture down here, so I've got scans of X-ray CT scans of walnuts, where you can actually see the walnut itself, but we can remove the inside meat part of the walnut to be able to analyze that directly. We've got so some scans of this is scans of barley panicles. So I'm actually going to talk about that a bunch of this in this talk because I like that project. And so things like we've got so one of my colleagues has this X-ray CT scanner that he loves putting things in, and so we've got all sorts of interesting scans of tons of different plants. This can also mean that I'm analyzing shape in sort of the less obvious meaning of shape as opposed to embedded information. So for instance, things like analyzing dynamical systems, which depending on time I might be able to talk to at the end. But having some way of analyzing shape and structure, in particular when it's some sort of shape in Euclidean space, and how do I sort of understand and analyze and compare those sorts of objects. Okay, so this is the slide that's always in here just in case, because usually I'm giving this talk in a like broad colloquium, and so if you're a non-mathematician, I have to warn people that I do topology and not topography, despite the fact that everything I'm talking about is maps, but not those maps. It's all very confusing. In any case, so topology in general is the study of shapes that are the properties of shapes that are preserved under continuous deformations, right? So if I can stretch and bend and the property is preserved, I'm not allowed to tear and glue, then I should be able to tell the difference. Now, what's fun here is that these were GIFs that were working as of yesterday, but they're not today, so that's fine. So the idea is, when you're thinking about topology, and usually people look at this, and the joke is always the coffee cup donut analogy, which is that if I sort of took this coffee cup and squished it enough, I would end up having something that looked like, okay, not the torus that you see on the right, but like a normal donut that has one hole. And so that's oftentimes what people sort of think of in terms of like, oh, well, you do topological data analysis, you can't tell the difference between a coffee cup and a donut. My argument here is that topological data analysis is actually very not quite that broad, because in general, a lot of the geometry is actually also encoded. It's just that we're measuring a lot of geometric properties with topological invariance and using some combination of the two. So maybe topological data analysis is a misnomer, but I didn't start it, so here we are. In any case, a lot of the things that I like to think about tend to fit into the following data analysis pipeline, which is that I have some sort of input data, which again, for a lot of my applications happens to be plant morphology sorts of things. So I've got some sort of X-ray CT scan of, I think this is a small grape plant. But the idea is to take something about your input data and encode shape and structure using some sort of topological signature. And there's lots of these options. I'll talk about these later, but these are some sort of thing I can compute from usually algebraic topology invariance, where I can come up with some sort of measure of something about the space. And then the next job after that is usually trying to figure out, once you get these weird objects that are representing something about your underlying shape, how do I actually do machine learning and statistics and classification problems and things like that on these, which is sort of its own beastly task on top of everything else. So there's a lot of these topological signatures. So I like to think of them as being in sort of 2 different piles. So I've got my sort of algebraic side of things. So for instance, oh man, see, I missed my GIFs. My GIFs are not working, but my Euler characteristic transform, which is what we're going to talk about a bunch today. Things like persistent homology you might have seen. There's some more sort of slightly more obscure variations like Crocker plots, things like that. But algebraic sorts of representations where it's really some sort of tool that comes from a straight up algebraic topology class where you're measuring something based on its algebraic characteristics. The other pile of things that I like to think about, but probably won't really actually talk about in this talk, are graph-based signatures. So there's lots of different versions of this. And so I'm hoping you guys can't actually see the video if I'm not covering it up. But things like mapper graphs, Reeb graphs, merge trees, all sorts of other sort of graph-based objects that usually take some sort of input data and spit out a graph that represents something about the underlying structure of your shape. And so, like I said, so for this particular talk, we're going to actually focus on the algebraic side for all of our inputs. So once you get there, the way I view it is that the goal of TDA is to come up with some sort of nice enough summary of the shape of your data that you can use for some sort of data analysis pipeline, right? So things that I find to be important in this sort of pipeline are the following. So quantifiable in the sense that I should be able to make a computer do it for me because, I'm lazy and I would much rather my computer do this for me. Concise, meaning it should be a simplified representation. So you might think of this as a lossy process, but the goal is that you're going to have some sort of summarization of the important stuff while sort of forgetting about the less important stuff. Comparable, so I do a lot of work in terms of coming up with metrics between these objects because these objects tend to be sort of weird representations of shape. They're not just a bunch of numbers, they're going to be something more complicated. Excuse me. And then based on this sort of ability to come up with metrics between them, I want these things to be robust representations of data. So if you mess around with your input a little bit, your representation should only get modified a little bit. So if I had a noisy sample of some underlying structure, I should be at least approximately the same summary of my underlying structure. All right, so for this particular talk, I'm going to focus on 2 bits. So we're going to do, I'm going to talk about the Euler characteristic transform and Barley in particular, and sort of how we use this one particular choice of a topological summary to analyze things with Barley. And then depending on time, I've got some stuff related to how we can use this for analyzing dynamical systems by saying something about representations of your underlying attractor of some sort of dynamical system. Okay. And so like I said, please feel free to stop me, ask questions. I'm happy to explain myself more. All right, so let's talk about the Euler characteristic transform. So what I love about this is that it is one of the simplest invariants to come up with. All right, hang on. You can give me 3 seconds. I'm just going to try to see if closing and reopening these slides is going to make all my GIFs work because they are not playing nice with me today. This might not work. We're going to try. See, closing and reopening did work. All right, let's get to that bit. Okay, so now we've got Euler characteristics. All right, so Euler characteristic is one of the simplest ideas of a topological invariant that we can come up with. So here's the deal. You give me some sort of structure. I'm going to work with some nice combinatorial structures to make my life a bit easier. But in particular, what I can do is if I have some sort of platonic solid or whatever sort of interesting shape, I can do things like count up the number of vertices, edges, and faces. And what Euler figured out was that if you take alternating sums of the number of vertices, edges, and faces in for these platonic solids, you happen to always get 2, right? So this is sort of a weird idea that all of these different shapes would somehow have this number pop out. But the reason this works is exactly because this thing is some sort of representation of the underlying topology of the space. All right, so if you give me any sort of thing that topologically looks like a sphere, it turns out that the Euler characteristic is always 2. Right, so here's my Euler characteristic of my sphere. And so with all of the platonic solids that I had as an example on the previous slide, if you squished them and sort of matted them down a bit and made them, a bit more smooth looking to look more like what you would think of as a sphere, they're all topologically the same as a sphere. And so that's why their Euler characteristic happens to always be 2. Now, I can do this for other sorts of shapes. I can do this for things like a disk. So a disk always has Euler characteristic 1, a open circle always has Euler characteristic 0, and so on. And so it turns out that you can spend a bunch of time in your algebraic topology class proving that if you have two spaces that are topologically the same, the Euler characteristics are the same number, right? Now, the reverse of that works is that if the Euler characteristics are different, I can promise you that you must have had different topological spaces to start with. So that's great. Problem is, I really want to use this Euler characteristic as some sort of representation of shape where I can go back and say, oh, well, here's this number that says something about whatever those things are that I want to be able to talk about. Right. So the opposite version, which is what I sort of want for this data analysis pipeline, does not work. If you give me two shapes and they have the same Euler characteristic, I can't promise you anything about anything. I can't tell you if they're the same or different, nothing. Right. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to add some additional information where I can sort of fix this problem. All right. So this is where the sort of geometry aspect of this whole topological data analysis pipeline comes in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build something that we're going to call a filtration. Filtration, the idea is that I've started with data. My data is always going to be something like a topological space and a map to R. All right, so that's my input starting information. So I've got my picture over here where it's a beautiful looking manifold with a really nice Morse function. It could be worse than this. Theorems stop working, but I can at least sort of start with that as my input. So for the purposes of today, I'm just going to assume I've got nice enough input data on nice enough topological spaces. So I can look at things like sublevel sets. So the sublevel set for a particular function is, I'm going to denote this by x sub a. So this is going to be the set of points in your original space that have function value less than a, right? So in my picture over here, all the stuff down here is supposed to be my sublevel set for this particular choice of a. And so the game is, what I can do is I can look at the sublevel set for a bunch of different choices of a. So sorry, this should probably have something on the bottom, which is that ai is less than or ai plus 1 for all of these things. But what I can do is I can take for a bunch of these stopping points, I can build up my topological space slowly using this function that I've defined on it. Oh, sorry, I should also say this out loud. So all of my function definitions, whenever I'm drawing these pictures, this thing isn't necessarily embedded in three-dimensional space, but whenever I'm drawing these maps, what I mean is that everybody that's sort of at this particular height function has the same function value, whether or not this thing has an embedding in RD or not, although in a second, everybody's going to have an embedding in RD. Okay, so these are filtrations. So the idea here is that once you've taken your space, you've broken it up into pieces, I can replace each of those subspaces with your favorite topological invariant and see what happens. Okay, so our favorite topological invariant as of the last 3 slides is the Euler characteristic. So this is what we're going to do. Okay, so let's take a look at this particular example. All right, so I'm going to mess around with my simplicial complex that's over here, right? So simplicial complex just means a bunch of vertices and edges, and I've got a triangle face in the middle here, and maybe it's embedded in R2 at the moment, the way that I've drawn it, and I'm going to have a function defined here, which is just where you are on this. Let's pretend I can draw straight lines, where you are sort of in this horizontal landscape. All right, so what I can do is I can, based on this particular choice of function, create a filtration of my topological space that sort of just breaks this up into pieces and sees how things change. All right, so in this example, so I've got at function value 1, I just have a single vertex by itself. At function value 2, I've got a vertex and 2 edges. At 3, I've got that whole piece. At 4, I've got this whole piece. At 5, I actually start seeing something a little more interesting. And then at 6, I've got everybody, right? So the idea here is that based on those pieces, this is supposed to be my x sub a, or apparently I've now changed my notation to k sub a. What I can do is I can look at the Euler characteristic of each of these stopping points. Okay, so if you remember, Euler characteristic was an alternating sum of simplices up here, right? So I can write it this way. For those of you that know what these words mean, it's also an alternating sum of the Betti numbers. So you can actually kind of figure that out based on numbers of connected components and loops and things. But the idea is that before 1, I don't have anything in my space, and so my Euler characteristic is 0. At a equals 1, I've got a single connected component that shows up. And if you chase all these definitions for all of these pieces, my Euler characteristic ends up being 1 at every time step. If you take sum of edges, whatever it is, edges minus vertices, right? So I've got my Euler characteristic is 1 for all of these times, and then at 5 it becomes 0, and then at 6 it becomes -1, and it stays that way for forever. Right. So this is what we call an Euler characteristic curve. Now y'all can yell at me about this because it's not really a curve, it's a disjoint integer valued thing, but I don't know, it's stuck in the literature now, so here we all are. In any case, what I mean by Euler characteristic curve is now for any function value for this for these particular level sets or sublevel sets, I'm just keeping the Euler characteristic of the sublevel set and then treating that thing as a function. All right. So I've got, for any filtration, I can now come up with this Euler characteristic curve. So let me show you a bit of what sort of data it is that I'm interested in thinking about. Right. So my starting input data for a lot of these things is going to be 2D or 3D objects, and for the things I'm interested in, it's going to be largely scans. So I'm going to think of these inputs as being just binary voxelized images, right? So these pixels that are 1 are in the leaf. This is a fern leaf that was from a scan that was provided to us by the Smithsonian. I'm sorry, I forgot to put their information down here. And then a 0 if you're not in the leaf. So I'm just going to be interested in analyzing the shape of the black region of this particular picture. Now, if I wanted to compute the Euler characteristic of it, I could, right? So it ends up being something like -200 on this particular example. But as we saw before, just telling you the Euler characteristic of a particular shape doesn't tell me a ton about the shape. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply this filtration idea to come up with an Euler characteristic curve to be able to break this up into pieces. All right. So the question is, what function do you want to get on it? And so the way I'm going to come up with a function is the following idea. All right, so this is what's called a directional transform. So the idea is I'm going to take some region in Rn. So that's going to be my pixels that are in my leaf. So we're going to call that thing D. I'm going to pick a direction. So let's take a look at, how about this one right here? So I'm going to look at the pi's or theta's 3 pi over 4 direction, right? So I'm going in this direction on this particular leaf. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a function. Well, the end goal is that you end up with a function where the level sets are the things that are perpendicular to this particular direction. You can do it really easy by just taking an inner product. So if I have some unit vector in Sn-1. Okay, so let's make sure this works. So I have data in my picture is n equals 2. My Sn-1 is S1. That's just a circle. So now this is just a unit vector on the circle. And if I take an inner product of the unit vector on the circle with whatever point you're interested in, that gets me a function on my space. And when you start chasing everybody around, you end up with just level sets that are perpendicular to whatever direction you're looking at, right? So in this case, color is supposed to be my function value in this particular direction. So 3 pi over 2, so I'm going straight down. So in this case, I've got level sets that do this. Here I've got level sets that do that. This guy's pi over 4. This guy should be level sets that do that. Okay, so given any choice of direction, I can get a function on my space. And then given any function on my space, I can come up with one of these Euler characteristic curves. All right, so what's going on here? So my Euler characteristic curves, this is now a threshold based on, in this case, I'm doing the 3 pi over 4 direction. So I'm going in this, that's my omega. My shape always starts with Euler characteristic 0 and ends with whatever the full shape has as its Euler characteristic. So in this case, -200. And in this particular case, I end up with this sort of integer valued function that goes generally sloping-ish downward. So all this is I'm going to take a bunch of sublevel sets of my fern leaf and figure out what the Euler characteristic is at any stopping point. All right. Okay. So problem is I have no idea what the best choice of direction is because there were lots of choices that I could have made. Right? So that's where the Euler characteristic transform comes in. All right. So what is this beast? For any direction, I can get one of these functions. So the function is for every level A, you give me the Euler characteristic of the sublevel set of that thing. Okay, so every direction on the n-1 sphere gives me this function, And so now I can compute this thing as some sort of data representation of whatever my input was. All right, so let's take a look at the version in, where are we, 2 dimensions right now. So in this case, n is equal to 2. And what ends up happening here is that I have directions. So this is my direction in S1. So that thing on the bottom there is a circle, 0 to 2 pi. And then all of the different thresholds, sorry, this is done by thresholds as opposed to function value, but this is all the different stopping places for my level that I'm interested in. And so what I can do is I can keep track of whatever this number is for every direction, for every choice of threshold. So the pictures I had before with that Euler characteristic curve, so a straight vertical line like this is a representation, a heat map version of the function I was showing on the previous slides. If you like thinking about it better, at least in the 2-dimensional embedded stuff, right? So I have this nice circular cylinder looking thing. The higher dimensional versions get wonkier, but this at least is sort of a helpful representation for me. Okay, so this is my Euler characteristic transform, or ECT, depending on who you talk to, right? So the other thing to point out is this is a beastly function that is dependent on whatever your starting input domain was. Okay, so why do you care? So we care because it turns out that this is actually a really nice representation of data. So we have the following theorem. This was by Kate Turner et al. From 2014. There's other more generalized versions that are a bit harder to state, but are also very interesting. So I'll point you in those directions. But here's the basic premise of this kind of theorem. The ECT, I can think of this as taking in some sort of embedded data. So let's say my embedded data is like embedded simplicial complexes. So if I have embedded simplicial complexes in R3, choice of that spits out one of these ECT giant weird beastly function things, a map from S2 in this case into functions from R to Z. And so the idea is this beast is injective. So what does that mean? That means that if you have 2 different shapes that map to the same function, they must have been the same shape to start with. And in particular, they must have been the same embedding of the same shape, right? Because this is somehow measuring information about the embedding itself. Right? So if it's helpful, so I did have I have a survey article that's up on the archive. If that's useful for you, it's sort of aimed at undergraduate level, sort of introductory to the material. So hopefully that's helpful. Okay, so what are we going to do with this beast? All right, so I can compute this thing. So we happened to use it on a project where we were analyzing barley because one of my collaborators is a plant morphology researcher. All right, so here's what we got. All right, so barley. So barley is one of the most widely grown crops in the world. And in the 1920s, Harry Harlan and Mary Martini, who are hanging out up there, again, I'm hoping that your videos aren't actually covering that up. So they went around the world and collected a bunch of samples of different kinds of barley from all over the world. So these are all these different strains of barley that they collected. And what they did, and I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm hoping I'm not flubbing the biology, but the general idea is they took all of these different seeds and then they took all of the different crosses with all the different pairs of seeds and took these things and grew out the results and then put them in a field and let them sort of cross-pollinate with each other and then just did this a whole bunch of times. By a whole bunch of times, I mean like 50 years worth of a whole bunch of times, right? So this is, when we're talking about an experiment with a data set, I'm talking about they grew out tons and tons of these different barley crosses for years. And then my collaborator on this particular project, Dan Koenig, so he's the one who's actually now the curator of this data set where they have access to panicles and seeds and all of the sort of information from this whole huge experiment that was started in the 20s. Okay, so Dan put a bunch of these barley panicles in boxes and shipped them to Michigan State, where my colleague Dan Chitwood took them and put them into his giant X-ray CT scanner machine box. And the result was we got these lovely scans of all these different barley panicles that resulted out of these things. So the first thing you'll notice, based on the previous pictures, so these barley panicles tend to have all these big, long, hairy things. Turns out those don't do great with X-ray CT scanners. So we sort of image processed those out. And we ended up deciding to strictly sort of focus on all of the seeds, because that was something we could look at really nicely. So my former PhD student, Erica Mezquita, who's pictured down here. So he went and did a ton of image processing on all of these X-ray CT scans and extracted something on the order of about 38,000 seeds, right? So this is really nice from my perspective, because we didn't have to sit there and either destroy any of the samples or manually sit there with all of these seeds. So now he's got 38,000 individualized seeds that we have scans of. And so what he did was he took these three-dimensional scans and then did the Euler characteristic transform on those, right? So again, I'm sort of swapping out my 2D picture to a 3D picture. So this is now my 3D scan of a barley seed, but the idea is the same. I'm still looking at the Euler characteristic for each one of these slices as you go up. Now, we had to do a whole bunch of sampling, so we picked a bunch of directions, something on the order of about 158 for this particular study. But so now what we have is the Euler characteristic for 158 directions for each of these input barley seeds. Okay. So what we decided to do was try to predict information about the strains that they came from based on the shape of the seeds. All right, so what we did was we built a relatively simple machine learning model where the inputs were each of these seeds, and then we were trying to predict the founding lines. So for this first part, all we did was we took that first line of seeds that weren't genetic crosses, anything like that. And now we've got a nice label classification problem, and used these different various inputs to try to predict which founding line of the whatever is 20-something, 20-ish, I think it's 23. I don't know, I'll count later. Different founding lines of these original barley panicles. So what ended up happening, so we did a couple of different things. So the first thing that we did was we passed in the Euler characteristic transform information. So there's a bit of processing that happened in here. So we actually did a lower dimensional embedding of it. So you end up with about 12 dimensions after this UMAP projection. But we got something on the order of about 75% accuracy predicting these founders based on the original seeds. So if we passed in just traditional descriptors, and by that I mean length, width, height, volume, surface area, the sort of things that you could get a biology undergraduate students to sit there for hours and try to analyze on 38,000 seeds and get a bunch of numbers out. We got something on the order of about 58% accuracy. Now, granted, mind you, we're doing these on scan, so it was much easier to do than that manual labor version. And so what I thought was very interesting, though, was that actually the best version that we had of all of these was if we combined both of these inputs, right? So if we put together the topological information with the traditional morphometric quantities, we ended up getting something like 90% accuracy. If you hang out with biologists, they get real excited when you get any sort of numbers like this, particularly in a large problem. The other nice thing with this is that we were using a very simple machine learning model. We weren't doing deep learning or anything. This was just a bunch of SVMs, essentially, right? And the nice thing about SVMs is you can go back and decide which of your inputs are actually giving you the most information based on your particular classification problem. And so this was sort of a nice proof of concept, which was that when we did those analyses, the directions that gave us the most information were the ones that were perpendicular to sort of the interesting stuff happening in our seeds. So these seeds kind of look like a football with like a thumbprint divot in them, right? And so the directions that were the most helpful were the ones that sort of went against those sorts of pieces. All right. So currently what's going on with this project is, so we first built a model where we used the model that we had trained on the founding lines originally and used this to classify the later strains of the barley. Because you remember we had this cross-pollination thing where we had sort of later generations, and then try to see what gets predicted in terms of the founding lines in those later generations. So the reason the biologists got super excited were that the first three or so of these classes, the Mason Carré, CA Mario, and Atlas version founders of your founder predictions, were actually the ones that the biology collaborators who have been doing a bunch of genetic studies on these things are actually seeing the most overrepresented in terms of the genetics. So the reason that this is exciting on our end is because we used absolutely no information from the genetics. The only thing that we had access to was shape and structure information. And so this gives us some hope that we can start doing things related to combining something with genotype and phenotype and trying to put that together in some sort of measurable, quantifiable way. Okay. About half-ish way through. So let me stop there and just see if there's questions on this before I take a bit of a left turn in terms of things I'm thinking about. So the general idea here is everything that I talked about before was Euler characteristic transforms. The next bit I'm going to do is try to figure out some more complicated representations of shape coming from the TDA community, but I'm going to use it on dynamical systems in this case. Okay. All right, so let's talk about dynamical systems. So one of the things that we got interested in was trying to figure out things like, can we measure the shape of an attractor as a way of saying something about the underlying properties of your dynamical system? So the example that everybody's going to start with is something like a Lorentz attractor, right? So I can write down all of the equations that generate my Lorentz attractor over here. And the trick here is that if you pick certain choices of my different bifurcation parameters, I'm going to get different sorts of outputs in terms of what's happening in my dynamical system. All right, so one of the ways that I'm going to mess around with this is if I, pick some certain nice parameters. So if I fix sigma and beta and I let rho vary, what we can see is that for different choices of this rho, you're going to get very different results in your dynamical system. So in this particular example, right, so choices like whatever this rho is, give me sort of nice periodic looking structures, whereas you can get all sorts of interesting chaotic resulting attractors, which is why this particular dynamical system is so interesting. So we were trying to see if I didn't know anything about my rho or whatever bifurcation parameter was changing, can I analyze something about the shape of what's going on in an automatic fashion to say something about changing structure in my dynamical system? So one of the sort of standard tools that people use for this, in particular for measuring things related to periodicity or chaos, is the maximum Lyapunov exponent. So for the purposes of this, I'm not going to go too far into what the actual definition is, but the idea is that this is a number we can compute from your input data that if it's close to 0, you're probably a periodic system, and anything else is probably chaotic, right? So these are noisy and difficult to compute, but it's sort of the closest option that we have in terms of these kinds of systems. And so for everything I'm about to say, we're going to use maximum Lyapunov exponent as my ground truth for what's actually going on in my underlying dynamical system. And then we're going to start comparing TDA results against those. Okay. All right. So the way that we're going to get from having sort of input data that might not be my full dynamical system, but might be something like a time series, is a common trick that's used that's either called Calkin's embedding or delay coordinate embedding, depending on who you talk to. So for a lot of these things, I'm going to assume that I was just handed some time series, like my overly nice example over here. I'm going to pick two things. I'm going to pick a dimension d that I'm going to go head into, and I'm going to pick a delay tau, which is going to be related to sort of, delay in terms of these points I'm about to talk about. All right, so the general idea here is that if I pick, okay, we're going to do dimension d equals 3 for this particular example, and I can look at 3 different points that are sort of uniformly spread apart that are on the input t space. And I can look at what the what the time series evaluates to on those 3 different points. And so that's my blue points that are over here, this guy, that guy, and I keep moving, that guy. And so if I just take those 3 points and I treat them as a coordinate, I get the red point that keeps running around here in the corner. And the idea here is that if you take all of these points and put them together, with good choices of d and tau, you can get a point cloud representation of whatever's going on with your underlying dynamical system, where the whole figuring out the right delay in tau is its own art form. But for the purposes of today, let's assume that I've just done a good job of that via whatever measurement process I'm deciding. Okay. So I can take any sort of time series, turn it into this point cloud representation of my underlying dynamical system, and those are the sorts of things I'm going to assume I have as input. Okay, so if I'm going to analyze the shape and structure, I'm going to use a more complicated invariant than the Euler characteristic. In particular, we're going to start talking about homology instead. So the idea with homology is that rather than taking a shape and handing you a number like the Euler characteristic, I'm going to take a shape and hand you a vector space. And before the algebraic topologists that are here yell at me, I am doing everything with field coefficients, and in particular, I'm doing everything with Z2 field coefficients, and so that statement is not wrong. Okay, so the game here is that zero-dimensional homology measures something about connected components. So my zero-dimensional homology for all of these examples end up having a one-dimensional vector space, and so that kind of goes back to say, oh, well, they all have one connected component, so that's great. My one-dimensional homology measures something about loops. So in this case, my circle has one loop, so it's got a one-dimensional vector space, rank 1 vector space for my one-dimensional homology. Yeah. But for instance, the torus, right, I have a loop that goes this way and a loop that goes that way, and they can't be pushed into each other or written as one in terms of the other. So I end up with a rank 2 vector space for my one-dimensional homology. So the nice thing about doing this is that, okay, I got to deal with chasing around these vector spaces, but they come with a lot more structure than the Euler characteristic has. All right, so in particular, if you remember what we did from before, so we had this filtration, and based on this filtration where I just broke my space up into increasing nested sequence of pieces, before what I did was I replaced each of them with my Euler characteristic. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace each of them with homology. And the trick with homology is that because, among other things, because it's a functor, if you replace each of these with homology, and I know that there's a relationship between the two spaces, you actually get an induced map on the vector spaces themselves. So we get to keep a lot more structure than we had from before. So the trick is, now I start with this filtration. I'm going to swap this out with what's called a persistence module. So a persistence module is exactly what happens when you take each of these pieces and swap them out with their p-dimensional homology, and I'm going to pick some p based on what I'm interested in studying. And on top of that, because I have this functorial information, if I have an inclusion of one into the other, I have a map on the two vector spaces. And so I can keep track of this, all this information in terms of not just the vector spaces at every point, but the relationship of how the different elements of these vector spaces sort of go from one to the next. All right, we're going to do a little bit of poof magic, and I know there's probably more algebraists in here. There's some really nice theorems that say, for nice enough starting input conditions for your persistence module, I can promise you that it can be broken up uniquely into pieces in the following manner, which is that I can come up with bars, which are, they end up being persistence modules. Let's see if I can make this work. They end up being persistence modules that have whatever I guess I was using, Z2 coefficients. So one-dimensional persistence, or sorry, one-dimensional homology for each of these pieces with identity maps between them, and then 0 outside of these things, Z2, whatever, right? So these bars are supposed to represent portions of my persistence module that have sort of pieces that I can line up with the appropriate choice of basis. So if you believe me that I can break these things up uniquely into all of these pieces, I can represent the information that I had up here with my persistence module in either a bunch of these bars, which is oftentimes called a barcode. So so these values, there should be values down here that have something to do with the lifetime values of when things appeared and disappeared up here. Alternatively, I can draw these things as persistence diagrams where I have a birth time and a death time, or an appearance and a disappearance time of a particular structure. And that turns into a birth comma death point in a persistence diagram. So in the rest of my slides, I'm going to kind of jump back and forth between which of these we're messing around with. But the idea is that given some input filtration, everything that you see here turns into some nasty matrix manipulation, but this is all computable.
I'm sorry, I have a quick question. I'm not
Yeah.
used to seeing any bars like on the same level in the barcode. What's the
significance
of that?
That is picture laziness. No reason. Nope. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Its own bar and this bar and this bar, and they're not affiliated with each other. And yeah, sorry. Good question. This is me probably needing to have a real legitimate example as opposed to just waving my hands around. But yeah, thanks. Good question. Okay. All right, so a common way to get a filtration out of a space is what's called the Rips filtration or the Rips complex. So the idea here is I'm actually going to come up with a filtration on RD based on having some collection of points embedded in RD. So the way we're going to come up with this is, well, actually, okay, that's a slight misnomer. Okay, we're going to do this a slightly different way. I'm going to build a filtration on a complete simplicial complex based on a bunch of points in RD. So the idea is that you give me a bunch of points. So in my picture down here, they're all supposed to be embedded in R2. And so for a particular choice of epsilon, so some distance parameter I'm interested in, I can look at, for instance, the disks of diameter epsilon equivalent to the radius is going to be a half an epsilon. The Rips complex is a simplicial complex I get by keeping subsets of my initial points for which pairs of distances inside of that subset are all at most epsilon. So in this particular example, because these points, and these points are all at distance at most epsilon between each other, then I end up with those edges in my simplicial complex. And on top of that, because all three are pairwise at the same distance, I have the triangle on the inside. Right, so there's another modified version of this that's called a check complex that's harder to compute. But for instance, here, if you were looking for places where all of these balls had a common intersection, that's a check complex. Combinatorially, we're going to work with this modified Rips complex instead. Okay, so what I can do is for any choice of epsilon, I can build up this simplicial complex for you. And so what I can do is I can put all these pieces together, compute this persistence, and then have some sort of representation of something about the underlying shape and structure. So in this particular example, I've got a point cloud that's sort of generated-ish from a circle. And what you can see is that my point up here on the way off diagonal represents the fact that in my one-dimensional homology, which is measuring something about loops, there's a loop that's born about the time that green point passes it, so that whole structure. And then once we wait long enough, the red line will pass it, which is about the same time as when this inside bit fills in. It's slightly off because I'm drawing your pictures with check complexes, but computing persistence with Rips complexes, but it's close enough for what it is we need to do. The other nice thing about this is that any of the other resulting noise shows up as points near the diagonal, right? So for example, if you keep an eye on like this guy right here, I've got a loop structure that shows up but disappears relatively quickly, and at least intuitively probably shouldn't be thought of as being the overarching structure of what's going on, and that shows up as a point very close to the diagonal down here. And so depending on your input, initial starting information, I might be able to tell you things about what kinds of persistence diagram you might expect. So if I've got data sampled from an annulus, like at the left, right, I'm going to have persistence diagrams with a point far away. If I have sort of two annuli that are touching each other, I'm going to have these two different points. Then again, I can't tell the difference between two touching annuli and two annuli that are sort of separated out from each other unless I go do zero-dimensional connected components. That stuff gets a lot more complicated, and I'm not particularly going to worry about trying to actually tell you, here's a persistence diagram. I can promise you this is the manifold it came from. But what I can do is take this persistence diagram and use it as some sort of information about my underlying shape and structure that I can say something about. Okay. So one of the things that we were thinking about was lots of, if I do analysis on things like the Lorentz dynamical system, so this is for different choices of rho. Again, these pictures are drawn doing barcodes instead of persistence diagrams, but it's basically the same information. Where here now I'm seeing sort of different sorts of shapes and structures in terms of, I believe the yellow bits should be my loops. Whether or not I see one long bar, so one sort of overarching circular feature in my structure versus lots of little sort of noisy bits that have sort of filled in over time. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to do analyses with these sorts of things where I try to take shape and structure of that original point cloud in the term of a persistence diagram and use that in some sort of attempt to understand something about what's going on in my dynamical system. All right. So one of the ways that we've been working on this is by using something called a Crocker plot. So Crocker plots originally came from looking at things related to moving dynamic point cloud. So the original paper by Ziegelmeyer et al. Is related to, actually, they've got a data study that involves video of aphids. That's really fabulous. In any case, so what we're going to do is we're going to try to simplify our data so we can actually try to visualize it. So what I'm going to do is, rather than looking at the full persistence, I'm going to look at the Betti number. So Betti number is just the dimension of homology. So the p-dimensional Betti number is the dimension of the p-dimensional homology. And what I can do is think about this as, well, so sort of like the Euler characteristic curve, I'm going to come up with a Betti curve where I'm going to be interested in the changing Betti number over time. One way to visualize this is, if you want to know the Betti number at a particular time, take a vertical line on your barcode up here and tell me how many things cross it. So that's your Betti number at a particular time. So my one-dimensional Betti number here is 2 because of my 2 intersections, etc. All right, so this thing still gets me this integer valued function. Sorry for my little questionable picture. But the idea is that what I can do is, for each of those bifurcation parameters, now I can come up with one of these things and try to stick them together. All right, so this should look a bit like what my Euler characteristic curve was doing before, or Euler characteristic transform was doing, but it's a slightly different analysis. So in this case, all right, so my Crocker plots are going to be, so my changing parameter is on the bottom here. My epsilon parameter for my persistence diagram is on the left over here. And what I'm doing is I'm taking that Betti curve and I'm just sticking it into a matrix vertically, okay? So each of the entries in here, if you want to chase it down, is the Betti number of the Rips complex of my particular point cloud for a particular choice of row for a particular choice of Rips connectivity parameter. Right, okay, so I'm also getting a 0-dimensional plot and a 1-dimensional plot for these particular examples. Okay, so the reason I'm interested in this is because we were thinking about changes in dynamical systems, right? So here's what we got if you start doing this on the Lorenz system. So here's the top bit is the sort of the normal bifurcation diagram people tend to look at. My Crocker plots are these two pieces in here, right? So my 0-dimensional, my 1-dimensional Crocker plot. And the thing that should stand out to you, but I guess stood out to us, is that the sort of regions that happen around where there's these periodic portions in the system tend to have very different behavior in terms of the Crocker plots. So again, we're sort of using the Lyapunov exponent as my ground truth in order to compare this. And so this particular paper, I'm running quickly out of time, but this particular paper, we did a bunch of analyses trying to compare things like, how do you compare the Crocker plots to the Lyapunov exponent to try to say something about this behavior that we're seeing in pictures. One of the ways that we did this was by checking the just the norm of the Betti vector. So essentially just summing up vertically and try to see how these go together, and then saying things about how close the relationship is between those two things. For time, we did it for Rossler, but it's essentially the same sort of idea. So just to give you sort of a general sense of where I've been thinking about these sorts of things, is that we've been interested in sort of a general idea of homological bifurcation analysis, which is, this is not normal bifurcation analysis in the like traditional dynamical systems sense, but how do you take the things we can measure with TDA types of tools and say something about what's changing in your underlying dynamical system. So all the stuff that I talked about with the Crocker plots is in that chaos paper. There's a, oh, actually, so this, I believe that's posted as of maybe yesterday or the day before. So we also have some stuff related to some other variations of this. So different kinds of bifurcations, different variations of persistence, and sort of what sorts of things you can see in these systems. Right, so the other thing that I've been interested in a lot is trying to figure out how to deal with computational costs here, which I haven't really talked about for this talk, but one of the downsides, in my opinion, of persistence is that compared to just about anything you might want to do, it is relatively hard to compute. So it's O of n cubed, but that n is hiding a bunch of terms we don't talk about. So the idea here is that one of the things we've been messing around with is, how do you swap out your underlying dynamical system point cloud representation with something smaller, in particular things like network representations of your underlying dynamical system, and try to use persistence representations of those in place of your original time series to say what's going on. So here's an example with something called the ordinal partition network, and we built this ordinal partition network on different kinds of input time series, and then you can say things about differences in underlying structure because the persistence diagrams of these things are way different. Okay, and so let me just do a little bit of advertising. So we have everything I talked about in the second half of this talk is posted in a Python package that's called Teaspoon. And so hopefully that is something that's useful for people. Not only does it have a lot of the sort of dynamical systems related stuff, but a lot of the other sorts of things you might want to do on persistence-based TDA research is available in there. Okay, so let me just conclude so there's enough time. Right, so the whole idea here is, at least the way that I view TDA, is trying to figure out how to take input data and come up with a good topological signature, and then a good way of taking that thing and turning it into something that I can do statistics and machine learning on. Right, so in the first version of this, my topological signature was this Euler characteristic transform, and that one is relatively easy to get over here because the outputs are just matrices or vectors of numbers or things I can sort of deal with. You got to be a little more careful when you start messing around with things like persistence diagrams because they're not exactly conducive to a direct application. There's a lot of tools for how to take persistence diagrams now and turn them into representations you can use in machine learning models, but that's a bit hairier and you have to be a bit more careful. So with that, let me just conclude by thanking, so this is my research group. The projects I talked about are largely the collaborators that are over here. And so with that, let me thank you all for your time and attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, let's smash that reaction button to thank the speaker. I'll stop the recording here.